Appearances can be deceiving. You've heard this, and it is true nowhere so much as it is true in prison and jail. I was thinking about this in the context of the first knife that I saw while I was incarcerated. Of course, calling it a knife is a slight exaggeration. You have to understand that weapons in prison rarely conform to what we traditionally think of as knives. You think of a knife as having a large handle to grip, a crossbar to stop your hand from jerking forward and cutting yourself on the blade. Even the blade you think of as a certain shape and even length. A piece, on the other hand, which is what this was, has very few requirements. It's almost always made out of metal, but that is not necessary. All you actually need is for it to be sharp enough that it can penetrate skin, and long enough that it can make it to a vital organ and kill somebody. That's the function of a piece. The first piece that I saw while I was incarcerated was a long, thin piece of pliant metal, about the length and diameter of a number 2 pencil. It had been originally used as the tie that secured the fence at the perimeter of the exercise yard to the anchoring fence post. It had been secured to that fence with a pair of needle nose pliers or something like it so that it was closely twisted to the fence. Somebody had taken the time, very carefully and probably with a lot of effort, managed to untwist it and take it back to their cell. They'd sharpened one end of it down to a nice fine point. I mean, it wasn't beautiful. They hadn't broken out the baby oil and the sandpaper to make a perfect razor's edge. But yeah, this thing could kill somebody if it had to. The first time that I saw this piece was at dinner. The breakfast in county jail consisted of all of the inmates standing in a single file line and getting their trays and then going to sit at a table. I noticed one breakfast that a couple of the native inmates had finished their meal very early so that they left the breakfast table before anybody else and they were back in the dormitory area alone. I further noticed that 2 of them were standing suspiciously. They were kind of shoulder to shoulder. They were blocking line of sight. Their third friend was back in a dormitory, getting into the windowsill that allowed you to look into the dorm. I didn't know what he was doing, but the entire thing seemed very suspicious, and I was curious. After breakfast, I made it a point to walk a lap around the dorms and to try and lean in, casually get that side eye going, and see if I couldn't see what they'd been doing at the window on the outside of this cell. I happened to know it didn't belong to any of them. This wasn't their cell. It was a common cell for some other people. As I walked past, I noticed a small patch of negative space in the windowsill. Somebody had drilled and filed and dug out a little hole at the corner of the windowsill so that you could slide something in there. It was empty. I inferred they must have been taking out whatever they had hidden there during breakfast. Sure enough, at dinner, those same couple of native gentlemen went to the back of the dormitories while everybody was eating, and again they obstructed the line of sight and seemed to be doing something in that windowsill. After dinner, whenever I went around, I was able to see the piece I've described, the small, thin, pliant piece of steel, which had been sharpened down to a tip and threaded into this small negative space area in a windowsill. This was a common area, you have to understand. Generally, whenever you're hiding contraband, the smartest, safest place to do it is in your own personal area or generally on your person. If you can maintain control of your contraband, then you know what's happening with it. This is especially true with a knife. If Jim walks up to you and he's decided he's going to have a problem with you and he pokes you in that chest a couple of times and he's up in your face, you have little likelihood to be able to go, hey Jim, I'm going to go over to that place that everybody knows I have something hidden, and I'll be back in just a minute to continue this conversation. He's not going to let you go look for your weapon. He's going to handle it right then. Similarly, if what you're hiding isn't a weapon, maybe it's a big clavo of drugs or a handcuff key or something like that, and you put it out in a common area where anybody could find it, you have made sure that if the cops bust in and search, they're not going to connect it to you. You're not going to end up getting written up or pick up a charge for this stuff. But you may just go by one day to get your little clavo of drugs or whatever it is, and it's not there. You'll never know what happened to it. This is the thing about common areas in prison. You're surrounded by thieves. A big surprise that they're willing to take from you. Mendocino County, where I caught my case, is a very rural county. It's not what people typically think of whenever they talk about California. This is Northern California. One interesting thing about Mendocino County is the demographics. We have approximately 3 times as many natives in Mendocino County as the national average. As a result, the Mendocino County Jail had probably 8, maybe 10% of the inmates incarcerated in the pod that I was in. They were Native American. They weren't a gang as such, but in a population of 100 people, if 8 or 10 know each other and they're willing to back each other's play, well, they have some clout. Unfortunately, at some point, they ended up having a problem with somebody else. That piece came out. I didn't see it come out, but as I understand it, one guy walked up behind a gentleman and kind of grabbed him, and another guy put that piece right in his face and told him they were going to stab him if he didn't leave the building, not come back, that he wasn't welcome there anymore. To be fair, the guy was particularly disliked. It was understood he'd been stealing. Well, he left, but he told the cops what had happened on the way out. "You need to get me out of here. There's some big scary guys with a big scary knife, and I don't know what to do." Well, they did. That's their job. But the next part of their job is the giant search, looking for that big scary knife that a couple of natives are supposed to have held up to this guy's face. I've mentioned before that Mendocino County Jail, most of the guys there, they aren't real criminals. They haven't done a lot of time. They lack criminal sophistication. You don't have organized gang structures or even dirty cops running drugs or anything like that by and large. It's a small jail. The inmates may lack criminal sophistication, but the guards knew exactly what they were doing. They came in 30 deep, and they got everybody in that dormitory, all 100 of us, and moved us out to the exercise yard, where we generally spent 1 hour a day exercising. On that day, we spent 4, maybe 6 hours out there, and those 20 cops tore through that dormitory like the wrath of God. To be fair, they had to take the idea of a sharp piece of metal, a knife that could kill somebody, real seriously. All they want to do is go home to their families, and there's some crazy inmate walking around with a piece. This isn't prison. These aren't hardened killers, but at the same time, they are guys with impulse control problems, aggression problems, and frankly, a lack of consideration of consequences. The last thing you want is for them to be running around with a sharp piece of metal with your name on it. Over the course of 4 hours, they took everything, all the stuffing out of mattresses, all the things off the walls, posters, pictures, anything like it. They went through everybody's paperwork, everybody's clothes, their pillows. They were thorough. Finally, the last step in a search is, of course, to search the inmates. So, this is the first real and routine strip search that I encountered while incarcerated. They had 2 officers who were taking inmates one at a time into a small closet, stripping them down, inspecting them, and sending them back to their cell. I happened to be sitting near the closet, so I would listen to the strip search, and you'd hear the officer go, "Take off this, take off that." And then they get to near the end of the strip search. "Show me your hands, open your mouth, bend over, squat, and cough." That was the part where you heard maybe a quarter or a third of the inmates start giggling or laughing or crack a joke or something. And you can understand why. This is a socially awkward thing for somebody to ask you to do. It's a strange environment for anybody. The officers were not having any humor about it, though. Somebody would crack a little joke like, "You got to buy me dinner first," and they'd snap back. "You think this is funny? Right now, squat and cough." I guess they drew the short straw. They weren't happy having to do this again and again. Well, it was my turn. I went through the routine, and everybody's back to the dormitory. I happened to be one of the first people to go into the dormitory, and of course, I minded my own business. I went about cleaning up my bed area, putting my paperwork away. But I broke at that side eye, trying to keep an eye on what's going on down the tier, and sure enough, whenever a couple of the natives came in a clump and ran right over to that windowsill, saw them lean in, and the big smile erupt on their faces. Those cops had searched the entire dormitory, but not that one small little dugout piece of windowsill. They must have just walked right past it 100 times. They never did find that piece, to my knowledge. I know it was there whenever I eventually left. For all I know, they still have that piece in what Dorm 17 C-Pod, Mendocino County Jail, threaded into the wall in such a clever little manner that they could just barely pull it out. They probably could have used the piece for its secondary function indefinitely if they hadn't elected to use it as a weapon. You see, the other thing they were using for, as demonstrated by the carbon scoring on the sharp tip, by which I mean that it was black and it had a thin layer of soot on it. You see, they were going into a back room in the afternoon whenever everybody was out on yard occasionally. 2 men would get down onto all fours, and a third would stand on their back, support himself on the head or shoulder of his friend, and then take that piece of metal and put it up between the contact points on the fluorescent light. They'd found out how to pry it into the fixture. This made it spark. The sparks would fly down, and then they would hold up a piece of toilet paper with some cotton from a Q-tip to make fire. They were smoking back there. They'd managed to find some tobacco that they'd had smuggled in, and that's what they were using the piece for primarily. This is the type of thing that's regularly used in prison, jail. I said appearances can be deceiving. This is the perfect example. It's not a piece. All it is a thin piece of metal that they use for sparking off of the lights. You could have heard 10 different guys say, "Oh, that's nothing. That's just the thing we use to smoke. It has no danger whatsoever." But then when things got real, and they did because that one guy was so disliked, I guarantee you it didn't look like a little toy that they used to get fire to smoke. It looked like a sharp piece of metal that they were holding up to his face when he couldn't get away. So appearances can be deceiving. But at the end of the day, a weapon is a weapon, and getting stabbed in the kidney is getting stabbed in the kidney. You don't care what it was, whether it's a beautiful buck knife or some sharpened piece of trash. Jail was a lot like that. It was a laid-back environment, no criminal sophistication. I thought it was a safe place. I bet that dude that had that piece put up in his face thought it was a safe place too, right up till that moment. So, in your everyday life, whenever you take your safety for granted, you just assume things are okay, do remember, appearances can be deceiving and the world can change in just one moment. Thank you for listening today.